Hey everyone, on today's episode of the Security Swarm podcast, I've got Philip Galea on, and today we're going to delve a little bit into the world of insider threats inside of 365. Now we're going to focus specifically on SharePoint Online, OneDrive for Business, and what an insider threat may look like in this situation, and provide some tips and tricks on how to guard against it. That and lots more coming up on today's episode of the Security Swarm podcast. Hey everyone, welcome back for another episode of the Security Swarm podcast, the podcast that brings you the knowledge and insights straight from the security lab here at Hornetsecurity. As always, I'm your host, Andy Syrewicze, and I've got Philip Galea with me today. How's it going, Phil?
Hi, Andy. All's going well. How are you?
Doing good. It's an interesting world in cybersecurity. I feel like I start every episode by saying that. And our listeners at this stage are just like, well, yeah, it's interesting, Andy. What else is there to say about it? But
I mean, it's changing all the time, and it's one of the most fast-paced industries that we're in. So there's always something new to talk about.
Oh, for sure, especially when we start getting into breach discussions and whatnot. We're not talking about breaches today, but I guess we're talking about possible insider threat breaches, but we'll get to that. But I say breach because there was another big CVSS 10 vulnerability I saw a headline for this morning, like another new one. And have you ever seen that picture of Ben Affleck with a cigarette in his hand? And he just looks like he's just done with everything. I'm like, okay, that is like the security professionals for like the last 2 or 3 years. So it's
That and the John Travolta one.
Yep, that one too, for sure. It's I've got both of those images on standby for social media use these days. So anyway, I digress. Well, Phil, our topic today is insider threats. And I guess before we really start drilling into that, I know you've been on the show a couple of times before, but it's been a while. For our listeners that may not know who you are, can you give us a quick introduction to yourself and what you do for Hornetsecurity?
Yeah, of course. It has been a while. So for everyone who doesn't remember, I'm Philip, and I've been working for Hornetsecurity now for about 9 years. I think as much as you, and
Yep,
we're part of the furniture. And
pretty much.
right now I'm heading R&D here at Hornetsecurity. So I'm a geek, and all I do is play around with new tech and build new ideas. And I just love what I do. I get to play and learn. And that's what we'll mostly be talking about today as well. I think just learning in general about new security stuff all the time.
Definitely. And I thought of you for this particular episode because, and I mentioned it already, we're going to talk about insider threats, but through the scope of 365 specifically. Now, you were one of the key minds involved with our permission manager solution here at Hornetsecurity. Now, again, this is not a product pitch, just kind of, it's relevant, just letting you know. But permission manager is designed to right-size permissions inside of SharePoint Online, OneDrive for Business, Teams as well, because, well, SharePoint underpins Teams, right? But you are a great person for this discussion because you had to wrap your head around patching all of those holes and those potential methods that insider risks could use to grab data that they probably shouldn't have access to in M365, which I know from our previous conversations, that was not an easy problem to solve. I know you spent quite a bit of time in, how do I want to describe it? SharePoint portal sprawl UI hell, maybe, is probably a good description. Because you could probably just describe it better than me, Phil, but I always explain it as like, okay, There are multiple portals to manage and right-size permissions for 365. There are multiple UIs within multiple portals and different tiers. And you have to go here to find this information, go here to find this information. And on top of that, there's some information that can only be surfaced using the REST API,
Code.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah. I mean, but this is the this is what you give away for leaving it up to cloud. I mean, like there are a lot of advantages for having stuff hosted,
right.
but at the end of the day, what Microsoft has with M365 is everything that was offered on-prem, but they're hosting them for you, and the things that are the wires that are connecting all of these different services, so that are connecting SharePoint on-prem but hosted by Microsoft, so SharePoint Online, and Skype on-prem or business but hosted by Microsoft, so that's Teams, and Exchange, and you get the idea. And all of the wires that are connecting them now, well, where those wires before didn't exist, now they're hosted by Microsoft and they have holes in them, and it's where most attackers manage to hit, and it's where most data is exfiltrated. Sort of these connections between these different services. So that's why SharePoint has 101 different screens. It's because all of these things are sort of very old and built, built on top of really old architecture, really old software.
It was built for a different era, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I've said it over the years.
I'm not going to say it's patchwork because I'm not going to say it's patchwork, but it's not cloud first. It's not with today's user in mind. So there's a lot of risk over there. And then, I mean, it's our job as security professionals to kind of identify these holes and these gaps in the connections between services in these cloud hosted infrastructures, and make sure our users don't fall through those holes.
Right. And it's funny you mention it that way. I had Eric Syre, one of our other guests, frequent guests on the show. Boy, I want to say this was probably 15, 20 episodes ago. And he was talking about basically the fact that if you look at cloud security in general, if you're trying to attack the infrastructure directly, an attacker probably is not going to be able to, breach infrastructure in most cases. But he said that, to your point, if a major cloud service gets breached, it's going to be through the identity mechanisms, which, to your point, is one of those hooks into cloud services, right? Into hosted services in general. And those are the difficult things to secure and manage, right? And when we're talking about,
in fact, you mentioned users. Wasn't it? How many weeks ago was it that Okta? That Okta got not hacked, but there was a vulnerability in Okta, and help me remember, what was it?
I remember seeing the headline. I don't remember the details. There have been so many breaches lately that it's been impossible to keep up on all of them. The big ones I've been keeping an eye on are the recent Midnight Blizzard one with Microsoft, and the recent ConnectWise Screen Connect vulnerability was another big one. But I remember seeing the headline for the Okta one for sure.
Yeah, they confirmed the network breach, and then hackers stole a bunch of information of its users from their support system. So Okta was using a customer support system that got hacked, and then through it they got hacked, and through them someone else did. And I'm trying to remember who did, but it's just a chain of different cloud vendors. And these are the connections between all of the different services that we rely on today, and it's on these connections that we have to be vigilant and constantly
Right.
monitoring for what's going on.
And so it speaks to the complexity of cloud, right? And we've spent so far in this episode talking about, those external connections, but I want to pull it into our kind of our core conversation for today's episode, and that is insider threats. So as difficult as it is to kind of secure those external connections, those external connectors into cloud services, it's also really difficult to lock down and uh, spot insider threats within cloud services as well too. And when I say insider threat, you know, uh, I've heard different definitions, over the years for what constitutes an insider threat. In my mind, it's either a end user that either by accident or maliciously tries to exfiltrate sensitive company data, or I've seen some schools of thought that would say a threat actor who has actively established persistence within an environment is kind of an insider threat as well too, right? Which I would say I'm more in the camp of like, okay, that's an ongoing breach that you just don't know about yet. But I could see the logic there, right? In either case, spotting those insider threats and watching for things like data exfiltration is really difficult inside of 365 environments because, to your point, the hosted manner of 365 services. And when we talk about the permissions and management structure for SharePoint, OneDrive, Teams, it's difficult to make sure that users only have access to what they need to have access to. Because when we start talking about mitigations, usually it comes down, one of the core things that you see organizations talk about is, the concept of least privilege is one thing that commonly gets talked about. And I guess while we're still kind of defining an insider threat, I don't know about you, Phil, but I always learn best by example, like real world example. And there's always a story that I share when I'm talking about insider threats. Again, folks that watch and listen to the show know that I spent a good chunk of my career working in the MSP space with a number of different customers of different shapes and sizes. So I worked with a large manufacturing provider one time, and they were a pretty large outfit. But there was a situation where a key knowledge worker was getting ready to leave the organization for a competitor. And they basically had created a forwarding rule on their inbox that
Uh,
forwarded out to an external inbox that they would then I can only surmise they were planning on taking that information and leveraging it after the fact, right? And so that would be a real life example of an insider threat. And this was particularly malicious because, like I said, this person was a knowledge worker. I mean, that person was dealing with core company intellectual property day in and day out. I mean, like designs for what this company did, essentially, right? And then you think about that data leaking going to a competitor, depending on the industry you're in, that could be very damaging, right? Anyway, so when we start getting into talking about mitigation, um, Phil, the one thing I've come across frequently when talking about insider threats and mitigation in 365 is purview. I imagine you've probably heard purview quite a bit as well, right?
y- yeah, definitely. I've had a chance to look into it a bit. Um, uh, it still has the same flavor as the rest of the Microsoft product. It's a bit, I'm gonna say, complicated to get into. Um, uh, but it seems to be. I mean, it's there to stop insider threats. It's there to bring you into compliance. I just haven't gotten my head around it completely.
Right. And our
So
good
it's
friend
kind
Paul
of
Schneck.
Microsoft's tool. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say our good friend Paul Schneckenberg has been on the show several times. I have often joked that I need to stop calling him a temporary co-host and just call him a co-host because he's been on so much lately. But he's dealt with Purview quite often over the last couple of years here, and I know it wasn't always called Purview. He's been dealing with the governance applications in 365 for some time, but he and I have always made the point that, like you said, it's Purview still has the flavor of other M365 solutions in that it's designed for the mega enterprises of the world where they have a team that Purview is all they do. That's their whole thing, right? So it makes it really difficult for SMBs and SMEs to get into those types of solutions. I mean, last I checked, Purview was, in this case, we're talking about Purview Insider Risk Management specifically. Last I checked, it's an E5 tier license required for that. So not only do you have a license cost, but there's an overhead in learning the solution, how it works, the intricacies of doing it at a smaller scale. It's like I said, your larger enterprises of the world are going to have the resources and manpower and probably a whole team
Yeah.
just doing Purview.
And
So
your
it's easy
smaller
for them.
enterprises aren't going to be paying for E5 either. I mean,
Right.
most of them are paying business premium. E5 is really expensive
It's
now.
expensive. Last I checked here in the States, I think MSRP, I think it's
45
gone up since then. 57 last I checked in the States.
per user per month.
Per user per month. Now, don't quote me on that. My license cost knowledge is probably a little dated, but last I checked, it was ballpark in that area, right? So it's expensive, difficult to
Yeah,
use, and
and
it's
as you
often
said,
overkill for the SMB and SME. Sorry, go ahead, Phil.
no, I mean it's typical of Microsoft products. It's like the old MMC style applications, so everything's an Excel sheet. Um, uh,
Right.
and I mean setting up the rules is I'm not gonna say it's complicated, but you need a team of people constantly looking at it, constantly monitoring, constantly setting up new stuff. And it's not something you can set and forget. Um,
Right.
and it should kind of be set and forget, especially for the smaller companies, because when you're an SMB, you just have the one guy, the two people maybe who take care of everything IT. You don't have a team of security experts constantly listening with ear on the ground, reading the forums to find out what new security threats and what they should be looking for in terms of audit events. So, I mean, I haven't found it in preview, but it should, in my opinion, it should give more sort of out of the box, like, hey, listen, you have to be looking out for this, and we'll look out for the best practices ourselves. Um,
Right.
uh, Kind of the secure score. But I've tried to get secure score up to 100%, and I can tell you it's near impossible.
Right. I've run into that myself as well. It's I got to say I like how Secure Score gamifies it,
Yeah.
but for those video game completionists amongst us, really difficult to get to 100%. Right. So anyway, um, but yeah, I mean, you talk about the administrator or that small team of two or three IT people for a small enterprise. They're time strapped. They don't have the time to focus on this, and that's where again, not trying to turn the episode into a sales pitch, right? But that's where a third party provider of permissions management tools, in our case, can help come provide some value, right? Make it easy to plug some of these potential insider threats. These how do I say potential vectors for insider threats, to patch those holes up, right? Like for example, our again, and you were one of the core minds behind it. You can, I'm sure, explain it better than I, Phil. But again, it's designed to right size those permissions in SharePoint Online, OneDrive for Business, show you what's shared with who, how, what does the permission structure look like, and give administrators and site owners in SharePoint Online an easy to use portal to resolve those issues, right? Which is one of the core things that you're going to want to do for when we're talking about insider threats, because again, we've talked about it already, but to reiterate, to the core things that you want to do for spotting and preventing insider risks is the concept of least privilege and access. Phil, you're, in the R&D team, you probably don't need access to the accounting site, right? It's just, I'm going out on a limb and guessing that, but
Maybe. Don't let them take away my rights.
right. But on top of that, on top of right sizing permissions, you also have to understand what your data inventory is, how it's shared, and do those regular account reviews and activity reviews. That's all part of mitigating insider threats. Before we move on to responding to insider threats, Phil, is there anything you want to add to that mitigation list? I kind of went through it rather quickly.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about mitigation, though, and you'll get into it, is I'm not, there's a bit of nuance when it comes to mitigation because you can't be too restrictive when preventing access because in the real world, some people are going to need temporary access
Yep.
for a week. Some people are going to need, and here's where the biggest data leakage comes out, where the biggest insider threats come out, where if everything was done as per the policy, where only you're saying least privilege possible, and only enough access is given, then we'd never have any data leakage. But
Right.
for 1 week a year, we need to give access to the auditors. For another week a year, we need to open up some folders for our partners. And then these are forgotten. We work with some freelancers. So it's constant monitoring. It's not just about setting the rules
Yep.
and just forgetting them. You need to kind of work in the real world and set the rules, but constantly monitor and be able to say, this is okay for now, but warn me in a week. Or so. What I'm saying is there aren't many solutions out there that manage to work in the real world. There are
Right.
solutions out there where you can set forth the rules and you can say, "Hey, don't let this happen ever," and that's fine in a perfect world. But the world isn't perfect, and exceptions need to be made. So I don't
Right.
find a lot of solutions where you can make these fine-grained exceptions, like time-based exceptions.
Right. And that's one thing I like about our solution in this area is the fact that, and I jokingly call it the CISO circle of happiness when I'm presenting it. So there's a specific slide in one of our decks I have in mind. It's a circle, right? And you
Yeah, I
got the
think I
CISO.
made that slide.
Yeah, you've got the CISO at
CISO
the
is
top.
happy.
Yep, exactly. And it's called I think the sharing life cycle or something like that. But I call it the CISO
Yeah.
circle of happiness. Anyway, you got the CISO at the top. He's or her. They've defined the what the sharing policy should look like for a given entity. And the example given there, and it's the one I always use, is marketing, right? Because marketing always works with a lot of external freelancers for design and graphics and things like that. Somebody in marketing goes and has to share something externally. And what I love about our solution is it can raise alerts to the marketing department head in this example and says, hey, Bob, your marketing person over here shared this file externally. Is that okay? And the marketing manager can say yes or no, essentially. And it's all logged and auditable and all that stuff, right? And eventually, as time goes on, like you said, those exceptions get forgotten about. But in this case, with Permission Manager, you can configure it that after 3 months, hey, is this external share still required? It sends that reminder, right? And at that point, they can right size those permissions again, and we complete the CISO circle of happiness, and the CISO is happy again, right? So anyway, I think that kind of speaks to the whole insider threat mitigation story, right? In that, right size permissions, concept of least privilege, ongoing monitoring, and everything we mentioned so far. It kind of encompasses all of that. But ultimately, like you mentioned, it's not a perfect world, and stuff happens, right? So the question I always get when I start talking about this is like, okay, we've identified a potential insider threat. What steps need to be taken? And again, I always look at this through through the lens and prism of our own tool set. The first thing that I want to know in a insider threat incident is, okay, what does the suspect user have access to? What's the blast radius? I want to
Yeah.
understand what their permission set is.
I mean, just before that, I want a message saying that it's blocked. So the first thing I want
Yes,
to happen
that too.
is like an account lockdown.
Yep, that's true.
Then I'll understand. So I need to know like where they're coming in from and that it's been blocked. So at least I can start counting from now. And yeah, I can go back and see what damage was done, but at least the bleeding has stopped.
Yep, for sure. And that cutoff point is important, right? Because you don't want the access method to change halfway through your investigation. So I'm glad you
Yeah.
brought that up. That's a good point. So account lockdown, discover what the blast radius is, and then at that point, I'm thinking you would start running your incident response plan, right? Because now you're going to get legal involved. You're going to get key business stakeholders involved. How bad of a breach is this? Was the data sent out externally? Who was it shared with? What's the
Yeah. What
business
did the
damage at
data
that point?
contain?
Yep, exactly. And at that point, and I feel like a lot of organizations don't do this. A lot of organizations will run their incident response plan until the danger is gone. But there's one really important step at the end I feel like a lot of organizations don't take is like,
A post-mortem.
right, what did we learn
What,
from this incident?
yeah.
Where
What could we
did
have done to stop it? Where did we fudge up?
Right? Exactly. I told you when we started recording this, we would get the fudge word in one way, shape, or form. That's kind of that's your one mark on the
Calling
show.
card.
That's your calling card for the show. There it is. But yeah, I don't see enough organizations do that postmortem and really understand what they could have done better to prevent said incident. So
I like
definitely.
how Cloudflare does that. And earlier we were speaking a bit about Okta. It was Cloudflare that got hacked because
Ah,
of Okta. So there was a user using apparently his Google account, his personal Google account on his work laptop. And then anyway, his Okta managed to get hacked, and using his Okta credentials, he was an employee at Cloudflare. His Cloudflare account managed to get hacked, and they managed to get access to Cloudflare's Bitbucket instant. So it's
oh,
like four different services connected to each other. And then they had a very good postmortem on what happened, why it happened, how they could stop it, and I mean technically sort of how it wasn't their fault, it was the user's fault, but at the end of the day it's still always the business's fault to make
right.
sure that the users are trained and following instructions. And I mean, I don't know how much training there was, but your users are your weakest link, and it's always going to be
For
the
sure.
users
For sure.
that cause these kind of insider threats. It was still a threat coming from the inside at the end of the day, because once it was hacked, hackers could traverse the whole sort of infrastructure using his credentials.
Right.
So if he wasn't an employee that needed that kind of access, that would have been stopped there.
Right. It's funny you mentioned these attack chains that involve multiple links between different applications. The other one that comes to mind, the other bad one for the industry, don't get me wrong, they're all bad, but the other one that was especially painful, I believe it was LastPass that was ultimately breached because of a outdated version of Plex on somebody's endpoint, if I remember correctly. So again, my memory's not that great, but if I'm remembering correctly, that was
I remember something.
yeah, and it was because of a Plex implementation was one of the methods that the attackers used to get in, and then the LastPass databases were lifted and moved out of the organization. Anyway, again, sounds like we need to do a whole episode just around the interconnectedness of cloud and applications and whether that has increased our security or decreased it. Right now I'm kind of leaning, especially given the last couple of years, I'm leaning towards it's decreased our security, but I'm saying that off the cuff. We'll have to get into that someday. So, well, Phil, I appreciate you spending some time with us today. It's always great having you on the show. We'll have you back to talk about whatever you're cooking up next in the R&D department as soon as we can talk about it. And I know we can't always talk about those things, but someday we'll have you back on the show, I'm sure. It's always good having you, my friend.
Definitely. Thank you very much, Andy. It's always a pleasure.
Yeah, definitely. And those of you watching, thanks for spending some time with us today. Hope you enjoyed the show. If you found value in today's episode, be sure to hit that like and subscribe button if you're watching out on YouTube. Otherwise, you can find us on all the major podcasting platforms. With that, I'll let you get back to your day. Stay safe out there. Have a good one. And we'll catch you again next week for another episode of the Security Swarm podcast. Have a good one.